Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It is July 1926, and in Part 2 we will see awards given for thwarting bank heists, a mistaken identity, another robber headed to the electric chair, a case of deadly friendly fire, robbers supporting their narcotics habits, and an 8-member robbery combine that terrorized banks throughout Ohio. General crime and anti-bank robbery. The Midland Journal out of Maryland and the Washington Telegraph out of Arkansas covered the Silver Veil Awards given to Miss Ruby Laverne Wilson and Mrs. Josephine L. August, both of whom foiled separate bank heists. Receiving one Silver Veil medal and a $250 reward was Mrs. August, a night operator of the Dowagiac, D-O-W-A-G-I-A-C, telephone company of Cassopolis, Michigan, who called for help from neighboring cities in an effort to capture bank robbers in the act. Another went to Miss Wilson, an operator at Southwest Bell Telephone Company in Washington, Arkansas, who with, quote, cool-headedness and ingenuity frustrated a bank heist. This latter heist goes back to the first story that we covered here on Decades of Heistery in January of 1926, when the robber Mayfield, who we later learned was named Joe Mayfield, was shot in the leg and the head with buckshot. We followed up with this bank robbery when we looked into the legal wranglings of Edward L. Griffin, who was another of the quartet of robbers who were caught, and were able to really build out the story better in the Part 2 May 1926 episode. The Washington Telegraph focused naturally on the local heroine, Miss Wilson, who in the interim between thwarting the bank heist and receiving the Veil Award had married. No longer Wilson, now a surname I've never heard of before, Puddephat, P-U-D-D-E-P-H-A-T. So if we backtrack to that story, it was December 16th, 1925, 2 a.m., and the Wilson family, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and their daughter, heard an explosion. Mr. Wilson, naturally, based on the time period, assumed that this was a bank heist in the works. So he ran to the switchboard to put out a call to local police departments to help. But he was ordered away by an armed bandit who was waiting at like a customer service window for the switchboard, about 3 feet away from where Mr. Wilson sat down to make the call. Our heroine, over the objection of her parents, went in and took her seat at the switchboard, ignoring the commands of the robber, who had a flashlight trained on her and a gun aimed at her. The bandit naturally ordered her to leave. She ignored him, remaining at her post, and noticed that the cables had been cut. But she kept testing different lines, eventually finding that the tow lines to Hope and Nashville, Arkansas were still in working order. Whispering on the line, she notified area deputies of what was transpiring. The bandit, assuming that she just didn't realize that all the cables had been cut, didn't bother interfering, assuming that this was a call to no one. The Hope, Arkansas deputy sheriff arrived after being advised of a shortcut that would take him from Hope to Washington. He arrived as the bandits were leaving and the pursuit began. And if you recall, or if you hadn't heard the story, the pursuit went through Hope, Nashville, I believe, and ended up in Shreveport, Louisiana. That's when Mayfield split off and went north to Little Rock, eventually went to the hospital because of his wounds and was caught. The other 3 were captured in Shreveport. Incidentally, and also receiving Veil Awards, not for foiling a bank robbery, but for various other impressive heroic feats, were Mrs. Mary Regina Smith Everett C. Nelson, and Emery D. Stein. They all deserve mention about 100 years after they'd received their awards. Follow-ups. Follow-up number 1, in a blast from the past, we reawaken the Hostetter story from earlier in the year. But in this case, we have a mistaken identification. An emergency squad consisting of Lieutenant George Winkler, Detectives Golnich and Schrum, and motorcycle policemen Musgrove, Miller, and Wise, all of the Indianapolis Police Department, surrounded Broad Ripple Park on Sunday, which would have been July the 18th, because it had been reported that Robert and Howard Hostetter were there. The Hostetters had robbed banks in Indiana, were alleged to have fled Indiana after a gunfight that we covered earlier, and alleged to have robbed a bank in San Antonio, Texas, that we covered earlier. But last we heard about them, they were actually in Buffalo, New York, and their paramours, that is, girlfriends, were living in northeastern Pennsylvania, I believe, or eastern Pennsylvania, where they were able to have close access to one another by car from Buffalo to eastern Pennsylvania, but weren't in close enough proximity that they would be captured. Well, it turned out that one of the men in the park was actually, of course, mistaken as a Hostetter and was considered an embarrassing moment for this guy from Zionsville, Indiana. What with having been surrounded and apprehended by police and then finally explaining who he was. Follow-up number 2 is a quick one, and it's regarding William Germain. In fact, we just met him in June in Salem, Massachusetts, where he was in the process of being extradited from Salem to DeSoto, Missouri, for his involvement in the American National Bank robbery that took place back in, I believe it was December of 1925. The delay was a habeas corpus proceeding that was to be held towards the end of July, July 21st. Quick hitters. We have 2 new quick hitter stories. Story number 1, the New Britain Daily Herald went back to a November 1st, 1924 robbery of the Wrentham National Bank, during which Celestino Madeiros of New Bedford, Massachusetts, shot and killed, quote, aged cashier, end quote, James A. Carpenter. Madeiros was sentenced to the electric chair, with the date to meet his maker being set for September 15, 1926, while his 2 companions were languishing already in prison, serving life terms for their roles. They were Alfred W. Bedard and James Weeks. There's a family history website with one branch that's focused on being White, W-H-I-T-E. A Bertha White was an employee of the bank and happened to be there during the robbery. This site has tons of period newspaper clippings on the story and even more information about the robbery, including photographs of Celestino Madeiros and Bedard and Weeks. I've linked that along with a town of Wrentham, Massachusetts website that has a little timeline that mentions the robbery. Quick hitter number 2. The Evening Star titled its story, 5 Bandits Arrested, Confess Many Holdups, and was subtitled, Accidentally Killing One of Gang During Bank Robbery in New York. So the title and subtitle basically tell the whole story. During the robbery of what was called a private bank, one of the robbers was actually killed by a friendly fire incident, shot in the back by one of his peers. His name was Peter Baranowski. It sounds like from the way the story is written that they grabbed Baranowski and they took off in a car and then set him / dumped him on a street corner. And my assumption is that they figured he was going to probably die if he didn't get medical attention, but they certainly couldn't have taken him to a hospital. Speaking of hospitals, this group of 5 confessed to having robbed the Roosevelt Hospital of $8,000. Incidentally, we'll see in coming stories that carrying a medical kit, including morphine and other medical supplies, will become common practice. But this was in New York City, probably a crowded area, and they just didn't have the ways or means to take care of Barnowski, so they dumped him on a street corner. Main story. We actually have two main stories for this July edition. Our first comes from Oakland, California, where we learn that two suspects had been taken from Oakland to Pasadena on charges of holding up the Lakeview branch of the Pasadena National Bank. According to the Imperial Valley Press, the robbers were able to get away with $6,000 after having assaulted the cashier. This is a violent crew we're talking about, as you'll see. So who were they? Joe Souza, 27. Souza spelled either S-O-U-S-A or S-O-U-Z-A, depending on the author. And Jack L. James, aged 29. Now, the Oakland Tribune noted that Mrs. James had also been arrested and that police were on the lookout for another person. So the details between the Valley Press, Imperial Valley Press, and the Oakland Tribune kind of step on one another a little bit, but we can kind of filter that out. So Jack L. James was also wanted in Stockton, California, along with his wife, for selling narcotics and for passing fraudulent checks. It hasn't come up in now 7 months of 1926, but the Roaring Twenties was not just dancing, not just cavorting, not just drinking legal and then illegal alcohol, but it also included it included drug use as well. And we didn't touch on it, but the Candy Kid, Richard Reese Whitmore, and his crew, some or all of them were reputed to be heroin addicts. So now we see Jack L. James and his wife selling and using narcotics. Souza was a parole violator from San Quentin who broke parole back in June of 1924 and escaped. Souza had been serving a term for robbery as it was. Souza and James were arrested at an apartment house. The former had on him a revolver and bullets that were the type that, quote, thugs, end quote, who beat Lieutenant W.F. Woods on the evening of June 8, 1926, during a grocery store theft. We'll hear about that theft shortly. Meanwhile, Mrs. James and an unnamed other person of interest were fleeing Pasadena in Souza's car. Word was telegraphed to authorities south of Pasadena, and she was caught. The car was then identified as that which was used during the robbery in the July 12th Pasadena National Bank robbery. So they're really starting to put pieces together. Now, the Tribune noted that 4 men and 1 woman were involved in the robbery, and that fits with what we know. Somehow the Imperial Valley Press left out that there'd been a frantic car chase and that the robber's car had flipped and 5 people inside the car escaped. If this facet of the story is true. More surprisingly in that case, Mrs. James went back to claim the vehicle as hers, and she was allowed to leave with it. So presumably the flip didn't do enough damage to the vehicle, or the details of this story are not being covered correctly by either the Imperial Valley Press or the Oakland Tribune, or a combination. Now we think we're able to identify the unnamed other who had been sought along with Mrs. James. We believe it was Eddie Welsh. Welsh and Mrs. James were, at some point, arrested and now being held in Pasadena. They were able to determine that the last of the 4 men in the 4 men, 1 woman quintet was Walter Gale. Gale, along with his wife, lived at the same apartment house where Souza and James had been arrested. Inside the apartment was merchandise that matched up perfectly with that from the June 8th grocery robbery. And during that robbery, the owner, J.E. Crow, had been pistol whipped and tied up by 4 men. So now it's looking like Souza, James, Welsh, and Gail are our 4 men, and the woman involved is Mrs. James. Not sure what Mrs. Gale's role was. During the grocery store robbery, they escaped with $100 in cash, $250 worth of merchandise. That seems to have been found in the Gale apartment. So there's going to be a lot to follow up because that's where the story trails off. Lots to follow up on these folks. Incidentally, adjacent to the story about this Oakland robbery crew was an announcement of the death of Robert Todd Lincoln. This Lincoln being the last to bear the famous Abraham Lincoln surname. Main story number 2 and our final story is our biggest story and takes us to Ohio, where the Evening Star and its Sunday Star edition, along with the Redwood Gazette, cover an Ohio gang that had terrorized the state with at least 4 bank robberies that I know of. We have 7 men and 1 woman who were arrested by the U.S. Secret Service and Cincinnati police. It turns out that that crew had used Cincinnati as its headquarters. At least 2 of these 8 were accused as participants in a $50,000 heist of the First National Exchange Bank in Sydney, Ohio. And it could very well have been more because during that heist, 6 men entered the bank shortly after opening hours. Cashier J.C. Cummins, quote, feigned ignorance, end quote, for which he got cracked in the head. Didn't really put the robbers off because 5 minutes later they'd gotten into the safe and escaped. 2 other participants of the 8 were accused as participants in the Hamilton, Ohio robbery. Meanwhile, others from the gang of 8 appeared to have been involved in a bank heist in Trenton, Ohio, and yet others were involved in the First National Bank heist in Norwood, Ohio. My guess is that various of these 8 had been involved in some or all of these robberies. It's so difficult for us to conceive of now with cameras and recording devices and databases and instant communication to imagine 100 years ago trying to decipher out of 8 people who aren't talking who had been involved in various bank robberies. But I suspect that of those 8, it wasn't just 2 involved in this one and 2 involved in that one. Details to come for sure. But the Norwood heist especially is memorable for us because during this heist, Larry Stagewald, who was a bank guard, was shot and killed. And Harry Rees, R-E-E-S, an assistant cashier, was wounded. Don't know whether that means he was shot or physically accosted. Stagewald will be added to our memorial honor roll. Now, the Sunday Star decided to focus on one of the robbers, he being Matthew McNeil. McNeil had been arrested with 4 others in Superior, Wisconsin. Ironically, since it's the same paper, according to the July 18th edition of the Evening Star, 6 men had been arrested. So let's say between 5 and 6 men were arrested in Superior, Wisconsin, one of whom was Matthew McNeil. McNeil, it was said, was going to plead guilty for his role in the heist of the Northwestern National Bank that took place back on December 8th, 1924 and netted $300,000. His statement of that robbery noted that 6 men had robbed the bank, but he was not giving names. That may have played a role in what we knew at the time was that he was facing between 3 and 30 years. My assumption is that 3 years for armed robbery would be had he given up the 6 names. 30 years had he not. So, time will tell. And that being for a man who, according to witness Harry A. Deigman, D-E-I-G-M-A-N, who was a witness and a cashier at the bank, stated that McNeil was the one who held a gun on him during the robbery. Well, whether it was 5 or 6 people who'd been arrested in Superior, it turned out that the robber's car had been being tracked by the police. And when the robbers pulled up in front of the bank that they intended to rob in Superior, the police jumped into action. The men were surrounded, and each of them were apparently heavily armed, and there was even a sawed-off shotgun in the vehicle. Now, the Redwood Gazette, you would assume it's a paper out of California, it's actually out of Minnesota, provided an editorial on using McNeil as an example of why going light on crime can come back to hurt you. And they kind of, at least in this case, have a point. If we reference back to McNeil, who had murdered a bootlegger years ago and received a 5-year sentence. Worse, he served 3 years, 7 months, and 18 days, essentially after killing someone, and turns out he was at it again. That 3 years, 7 months, 18 days is reminiscent of a Hank Williams III song, which I may, just because it's a good song and I like Hank Williams III, include a link to that as well. Well, I have included links about Shelby County, Ohio history, which includes a bit about their heist, and a link to the Norwood, Ohio Historical Society, which has a picture of the bank, and another link that shows currency that was actually printed at the bank in Norwood, Ohio. Well, as always, there's lots to fill in. We need resolution on the Ohio robbers, as well as from the follow-ups and the quick hitter stories that we covered. Plus, we need to find and track Sousa, James, and company from California. We'll update as these folks go through the justice system and add to the stories as details become available. Well, July did heat up quite a bit. Lots of gunplay and mayhem. We have awards given for heroism, but we also got a glimpse into the dirtier side of what we sometimes romanticize as the Roaring Twenties. We have drug use, drug dealing, theft, physical violence, and plenty of killing, which made July of 1926 a fierce one. We'll move on to August of 1926, which can only get hotter. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Until next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye bye, blackbird.